Hey, Dana.
Hi, Frances.
How are you?
Jinx. You want me to know?
Yeah, Jinx. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about The East is a Podcast, which is a podcast by Sina Rahmani. And he discusses books, ideas about the East, broadly speaking, from an anti-imperialist leftist frame. And there are a lot of crossovers with other podcasts of similar inclinations, but focused on different locations and different topics. So it's kind of, I've been listening to it for a while. So
I trust your judgment.
Yeah, that's why you said yes.
I'll definitely got to check it out.
Yeah, so I'm interviewing you as part of a sub-theme episode series that pushes further on themes like feminist thinking and activism within anti-imperialist, socialist, and transnational understandings. And that includes Palestine, as you know, it always does for both of us.
Of course.
Yes. So I know you as an activist and a friend, most importantly for your organizing around Palestine. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your interests?
Sure. Well, I guess if it wasn't obvious, I'm Palestinian. I'm from Abediyah, which is next to Bethlehem. My dad would always joke that he's a holy man. It's out of dad jokes, classic, right? Yeah. But I actually have never been to Palestine. My family, both on my mom and dad's side, had left during 48, so during the Nakba. The catastrophe. And both of my parents, both went to Jordan. And then afterwards, over time, they got a job in Saudi Arabia. And so that's where I was born. So I actually grew up in an American compound in Saudi Arabia, part of Aramco. So I had definitely a very unique upbringing. And so I can relate to a lot of people's upbringing, like in the US, because I feel like my upbringing in the American compound was similar, but I was still like very much in the Arab world and I left the compound a lot. And then over time I ended up coming to the US and studied and completed my degree here. And just growing up in Saudi Arabia, and actually there was a military base near us, like there would be jets flying over, practicing for what? Like literally killing our people. It was just so, I don't know how to even describe it in words. And I also was born during the Gulf War, and I very much knew, just growing up, yes, in the 90s, it was the Gulf War and this betrayal of Kuwait and letting the US come in to invade Iraq. And so that was something that I always knew growing up as a kid, and just especially as a Palestinian, even until today, you see 4-year-olds always talking about imperialism, right? It's just yeah, they're very smart, but it's also, it's sad that the children are such robbed of their childhood. But even though my personal upbringing and I was very much exposed to U.S. imperialism in many ways, I still believed in the American dream. So I was so excited to come to the U.S. and, this whole pull yourself by your bootstraps. I just thought it was you're gonna work hard and you make it. And then I came here to the U.S. and I was like, well, people are just busting and they're not getting anything. They're working multiple jobs, and just the idea of all the fast foods and the drive-thrus, that was so unique to me, something not often found in the Arab world. Well, now things are changing, but that was always so fascinating to me. I was like, people are so busy going from job to job and just go through the drive-thrus to pick up their food, and are just forced to eat in their cars. And I was like, this is not the American dream. And so over time, that's really when I began to question a lot of things and more, and that's when I became more involved. And so during grad school, I had founded Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at the University of South Carolina. And that's when I was like, oh, it's not enough to be Palestinian. You got to read. We got to know about our cause and our struggle so we can defend ourselves. And then over time, that's when I really began to understand hey, it's not just us Palestinians struggling for self-determination. Look at nationally oppressed people here in the US and even across the globe. And so that's when I actually became introduced to socialism through the Party for Socialism and Liberation that I'm a member of. And then when I first joined, I was like, what's Marxist-Leninism? But I learned over time, and that I learned that the only way that we as Palestinians can be free is if we are united with the working class and the oppressed nationalities of the world. And so that's just a little bit about myself.
Cool. That's more than I knew.
Okay.
So I know you recently organized a Nakba commemoration rally in Raleigh, North Carolina. Can you share some of the highlights?
Yeah, this year was the 4th rally that we've hosted 3 years in a row. You were actually at the first one back in 2021, when I felt like Palestine was really very widespread on social media and that a lot of people came out. So back in 2021, we actually had over 4,000 people who came out 2 weeks in a row. So we actually hosted the largest Palestine rally in the history of North Carolina. And
is that where I met you?
Yes, I remember.
Yes.
I remember you at Worcester, and you're like,
who is this girl from South Carolina? Are you in North Carolina or South Carolina? Yeah.
And I remember you knew about the rally on Breakthrough News.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I was like, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, that's so great. Such a small world. Yeah. And so from there, it was like, well, we have to continue this tradition of hosting rallies to commemorate Al-Nakba. And this is something that specifically, as you know, this is what Palestinians on the ground call for, and not just to commemorate Al-Nakba on May 15, 1940, right? Well, May 15 every year, commemorating it from 1948, but every day that we need to, raise awareness about the ongoing colonization and occupation of Palestine. And so the rally is really to give Palestinians a space to share their stories, because we have many Palestinians. Raleigh has a huge Palestinian population, and many people whose families were forced to leave during the Nakba, whether it was their dads, their grandparents, their grandmother. And so it's a place for Palestinians to be able to uplift their story. But as we know, that it's been 75 years plus of the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing colonization, destruction, and displacement of the Palestinian people, but it's also been 75 plus years of resistance. Yeah. And so really we use the rally too as a place to really assert the Palestinian people's right to resist by any means necessary. Because when people are occupied, resistance is justified by any means. And so that's really one of the major things that we were able to do at that rally. And so we began actually with a teach-in. I did a co-teach-in with Rania Masri, who is from Lebanon, because the Lebanese people, we're all in this together. This is our struggle together against Zionism and U.S. imperialism. And I think that the true, the unity and militancy rang true in the streets of Raleigh from our
I remember rally. That. Yeah. That was an amazing rally. Yeah. And then this year it was a little smaller. But we still had. What were the highlights? Yeah, we had about 300 people come out, which honestly, pretty great. Yeah, right. Yeah. And because now we're kind of in a low political moment as well, but we still people are still coming out. Yeah. Fantastic. And the teach-in was this year when we were able to do that. And so that was really great. Yes. And we also gave a message of, I think for me, maybe one of the highlights was we had one of our comrades, a trans woman, who also spoke about LGBTQ solidarity, and that she talked about why she has no friends in the Zionist state, despite, the Zionist myths or attempts of pinkwashing, attempts of painting themselves as this queer, friendly, gay haven place, but that couldn't be anything further but from the truth. Yeah. And so she gave such a very powerful speech and really expressed her solidarity to the Palestinian people. And so I think for me, that was one of my highlights. Yeah, wow. Yeah. That's great. And I have a second highlight now that I'm remembering. Good. And so there was a Palestinian high schooler who I met back from 2021. And so we've been working together and reading and studying. And she came to me a month before the rally and she was like, Dana, I want to speak. I was like, hell yeah. Okay. What do you want to talk about? I don't know. And I was like, well, what's important to you as a Palestinian? It's always best to speak from the heart. And so she talked about Palestinian political prisoners and their ongoing struggle, and talked about the recent martyr, Khader Adnan, and his struggle, and what it's like for Palestinian prisoners, why every single Palestinian prisoner is a political prisoner. And so she gave that speech in front of the prison, because we had marched about a mile, and then we stopped at the prison because we always want to send strength and love to all those locked on the inside who really,
give the most ultimate sacrifice to the cause. And so she gave this really powerful speech, and not just talking about Palestinian prisoners, but also Black prisoners and all prisoners in the U.S. and how these struggles are connected, and why, you know, we understand that the Black liberation struggle is also integral to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And so,
I wish I was been able to come
next time. Inshallah.
Next time, inshallah. So, as you know, there are many systemic or systematic problems in North Carolina. I say systemic, like in the U.S. generally. It's dramatic in democratically controlled progressive, so-called progressive cities like Durham and Raleigh, and Chapel Hill, where developers, landlords, and the wealthy have the most power and influence. On top of all that, we have regular moral panics driven by media, policy, and legal campaigns by right-wing forces, often religious, who push their commitments to their vision of the so-called family, which seems to exist outside of any like real histories and materialities. Their targets are almost always sexual and gender dignity, like attacking that, and self-determination and health. So I was just wondering, I always wonder, because I really admire you as an organizer. You have a full-time job and you're an organizer. And
full-time jobs.
That's 2 full-time jobs. And so I wanted to ask you how you manage to connect the dots in your organizing, including between these conditions and like U.S. imperialism and Palestine. And what are some of the challenges? And you can be honest about that, because I'm familiar with some of them.
Yeah. You might need to remind me when I get there.
Yeah.
But actually, something that this reminds me of, a story I'd like to share. I was earlier today at a rally at Shaw University. So I don't know if you heard, but Shaw University has an application to rezone that's been going on for a while.
What kind of university is Shaw?
It's
is it an
HBCU. Yeah.
Got it.
It's an HBCU. It is the alma mater of Ella Baker and the founding place of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so So obviously, without a doubt, there's so much significance and history and legacy with Shaw University. And there's such few institutions today that Black working class people can actually access. And that, you know, so Shaw University in many ways does deserve to have a room to develop and to improve their buildings, and to invest in actual Shaw University. Like, especially now, you know, talking about these right-wing attacks, we see these right-wing attacks on education left and right. And so many students accruing so much debt when, you know, education should be free and accessible. And so, you know, we support that Shaw University should be able to improve their conditions and to continue to maintain access to Black working class people. But the thing is, with the rezoning application, it's not quite about that. It's quite a vague application with no comprehensive plan, and that they're working with developers to bring in commercial and retail within the area of Shaw University that's downtown Raleigh and close to Southeast Raleigh. And so this Raleigh is actually one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. What does that mean? That means gentrification, anti-Black racism, pushing people out of their homes, and we're seeing so many more and more people like forced to leave Raleigh. I remember one time at a city council hearing, these sanitation workers were speaking and demanding a higher wage. And they're like, you know, how a lot of them have been pushed out of Raleigh and can no longer afford to live here and have to live in some of the, you know, rural parts of Raleigh. And I remember that worker at city council was like, please, I don't want to live in Rocky Mount. Although there's a lot of great history, no shade to Rocky Mount. But, And so, you know, this is what we're seeing in Raleigh, and that,
and also in Durham. Durham has become less Black, less working class. The skyline has transformed. It's really shocking.
Yeah. People have told me, like, because they've lived in Durham for so long, it's like you don't even recognize it anymore. It's the same with Raleigh as well. Both of these cities. And both of them have such like historically Black neighborhoods.
Yes.
And so as part of this Shaw University's rezoning plan, that will bring in further, like, retail and commercial use is obviously going to further gentrify the neighborhood. And then just putting in more concrete and replacing soil with concrete is also going to exacerbate the climate crisis and increase flooding, particularly in neighborhoods in Southeast Raleigh. And Southeast Raleigh is a historically Black neighborhood that already have been experiencing such devastating impacts from flooding, and this will further increase that.
Yes.
And so this is not at the benefit of the students, not at the benefit of like the alumni, or the people who live in that neighborhood. And then another part of this story is that there's a masjid, there's a mosque at Shaw University that was built back in 1983. That was the first mosque in Raleigh. Okay. And it primarily serves, it's a place of worship for mainly Black Muslims and just, Muslims to come gather and worship and, be together. And on and off, the mosque has been closed. And since 2020, the mosque has been closed to the Muslims. And the Shaw University administration has cited different reasons here and there. One of the main reasons they've cited is because of COVID, but the chapel at Shaw University is open and people are going there. So it really begs the question of what's going on here, right? And so, and then at the last city council meeting, these city council members who are all Democrats, you're talking about these like so-called progressive cities, but a lot of them were, it's kept saying that the rezoning of Shaw University is completely separate from the mosque issue. And that's not true. These are part of the same issue. Because if the rezoning application goes through and is approved by Raleigh City Council, this will permanently close the mosque. And so today we had a rally that was hosted by alumni of Shaw, people in the neighborhood who have been impacted by this, and a lot of Muslims who've been calling for the mosque to be open, and just many different groups who have been impacted have come together and have called, to save our Shaw, to open the masjid, and to call on city council to deny the application. And so the hearing will be on Tuesday, June 20th at 1 p.m. And so the city council has kept postponing the hearing amidst public pressure, because we had like 200, 300 people come out to these city council hearings, and many Muslims actually. And so we still want to continue to do that to make sure that this doesn't go through. And so, to me, this is just a story that really does depict, talking about gentrification, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, attacks on education. And so we can see how all of these issues are connected.
And then I often notice that when you speak, you're very sophisticated at drawing the connections, truly, between like, the international and the national. Like we live in a highly militarized, I don't know which state is not militarized, but there are a lot of military bases. There are a lot of veterans, but also there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of inequality. There are a lot of really disproportionate health suffering of certain groups, including the undocumented. But I was just wondering how you connect in this organizing, which you really are a door-to-door, you're an organizer, you're a door-to-door, you're a trainer, you're a thinker, how you do the connecting with like, the global South, with imperialism, with war, So how do you do it? So what do you do?
Well, I guess just to continue using the rezoning application at Shaw University, that they're calling for millions of dollars from Raleigh City Council to invest in this development use. That who's it going to benefit? Right. It's going to the developers, the upper class bourgeoisie. It's not going to benefit the people, right? And so all of this money that we see is like going towards this. Meanwhile, you have groups of people, for example, an organization called Refund Raleigh that has been calling for a no police crisis response team in Raleigh, and they have been asking city council to do this, and city council's always like, oh, well, we don't have the money. And it's like, well, this is really affordable.
Yeah.
And as you know, like there's a similar program in Durham.
Right. I don't want to speak too soon, but it already exists, and I think it's going to be expanded to 12 hours a day.
Oh,
yeah. And I think the goal is to have it 24 hours.
Yeah.
The whole city. And actually, Ajamu Dillahunt came and spoke at the pre-rally at the city council meeting that I attended on Monday.
Yeah. And he's one of the founders of Refund Raleigh.
Okay.
So this program, Heart, that's in Durham, can really serve as a example of how we can do this. And we do need it to be 24 hours and expand it to 24 hours.
Yes.
And so we're trying to implement the same thing in Raleigh, because we should invest in us and the people.
Yeah.
But instead, where does our money go towards? Goes towards developments, goes towards war, goes towards military, and
the police.
Yeah. Right? Because actually, thanks for reminding me, that's the goal of Refund Raleigh, is to take money away from the police. They don't need their $10 million. Like, what are they even doing? If you look, I remember one time, like, looking through like their budget to see what they spent money on. One time they spent like a ridiculous amount of money on just ice cream trucks and passing out ice cream to the neighborhood, just to attempt to make certain connections with the neighborhood. But at the end of the day, we know the role of the police, and that is to they're part of the state. It's to maintain the power. It's to protect the interests of the capitalist class. Yeah. And so all the money is going towards the police and military, and particularly Israel, right? Israel is the largest recipient of military equipment of the U.S. We're talking about $10 million a day.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
I think specifically North Carolina gives $850 million. And so that money...
You mean like the state, or if you divide it up? Yeah, the federal.
Yeah, if you divide it up.
Yeah, wow.
Because there's a website, U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. They have a website, and you can look it up each state.
I see.
And then you can see what that could fund. Like, you can fund school teachers, you can fund pencils and supplies in schools, healthcare.
Yes.
And that's what we need. And to actually fund Shaw University to serve the students, and that all the people who've been kicked out of their homes have people to actually live in their homes. Because fortunately today what we see is like homes are not meant for people to live in, because how many empty houses do we have versus how many homeless people we have, right? There's over 11 million homeless people with so many empty houses.
Yes.
And so we actually need to live in a society where homes actually
are decommodified.
Yes.
Use value, not exchange value.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
So I was just like wondering, so one of the reasons that I wanted to do this, work with Sina to, develop this theme, is I think the kind of that feminism and feminists are like really shockingly aligned with the neoliberal and also queer organizing, or the symbolics of queerness seem to be very aligned with like the neoliberal state, with imperialism. I mean, sometimes it takes on like different colors, but there isn't a radical kind of critique. And I actually am remembering that, there were even some tensions in North Carolina around a couple of years ago around reproductive rights organizing. I just remember there was a division between right to abortion groups, around imperialism, around Israel, around race.
Yes.
Do you want to recap it?
Yeah.
Because I'm not fresh on it. And I just want to basically generally ask you about the anti-imperialist feminist organizing in these settings, like how you manage them, because we also have a lot of really great groups that do make the connections, and most of them are dominated by people of color, queer people, and they're doing everything. You
Yeah.
know, they're working on police stuff. They're working on housing.
That's
They're
right.
working, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
But go ahead if you...
Yeah. No, just to that point, I think overall, like, you would see in so many, especially like, you know, radical and socialist spaces are often led by queer people, queer trans women, and
Yeah.
those often have been my mentors too.
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah, absolutely. And so a few years ago, before Roe v. Wade was overturned, which so I guess this was October 2021.
Mm-hmm.
What is time? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
so I think it was in October 2021 where it's like, you know, the traditional maybe Women's March.
Yeah.
And so we had, I worked with many different coalition partners and we put together a reproductive rights rally, and they had asked me to speak. And I was like, well, I obviously know what I'm going to speak about. I am a Palestinian Muslim woman. So I'm going to talk about like, you know, what reproductive rights mean to us.
Yeah.
And that, you know, typically what we hear from the U.S. war is like, you know, the U.S. military machine is, oh, we're going to go to a war. We're going to go to Afghanistan to save the women.
Yeah.
So absurd. How do you're going to drop bombs to save women?
You're
Like,
right.
we're going to bring them democracy, like through military, through occupation, through violence.
Yeah.
And it's like war is the greatest threat to women and queer people.
Yeah.
And that, and just the impact that it has, particularly, you know, for us women in the global South.
Yes.
So I did talk about that and that what it means for me as a Palestinian woman, and that, yeah, okay, sure, as in Palestine, we do live in a patriarchal society, but who's the person that prevents us from accessing healthcare? That you know, arrests the men to where women are forced to not just take care of their children and clean the homes, but also to work. It's Israel. It's the occupier, and we know who our enemy is. And so that's exactly what I said. I spoke the truth, and
Yeah.
it was very well received. I had a whole group of high schoolers come up after me and were like, "Oh my God, free Palestine!" And I was shocked because I was like, I moved here when I was in high school, and the Palestinian sentiment was not like that, but
Yeah.
they were all with it. And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
But then the next day, unfortunately, there was a long list of emails that started going, and there was one person who felt that was completely inappropriate and out of place, and that there was absolutely no room for Palestine, and they wanted me to apologize and not do it again. And I responded in a very short, concise email just to thank the other people for giving me a platform, and that I'm going to continue to speak on Palestine, and that everyone should always bring Palestine to the forefront, because
Yeah.
these issues are connected and they're intertwined, and that if we want to fight for women, that means that we have to fight against imperialism. We have to fight against war,
Yeah.
and fight against, you know, the U.S. military machine. And this also makes me think too about Iran, especially.
Yeah.
I think it was it last year?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It happens every once
It happens,
in a
yeah,
while.
yeah. But then this, you know, as you know, sparked outrage in the U.S., right? And that we literally saw how the media actually put out posts that was completely false. And then I remember Instagram coming and they were like, no, we have to take this down. This is completely false. And it was some lies against the Iranian government. And, you know, so here we are seeing yet again another example from the U.S. machine of putting these lies against these countries that they find a threat, and saying like, oh, look, they're oppressing their women. And it's really ironic because it's not like women are free here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just one prime example is look at the abortion rights, like how limited access there is to abortion, and just attacks on bodily autonomy left and right.
Yeah.
And that's just one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, that was always, you know, I just saw a lot of people who I worked with and coalition with that were like, yeah, you know, feminism, we got to go and support the Iranian women. And I'm like, you want to support the Iranian women? You need to call on the U.S. to end sanctions on Iran, because, you know, sanctions are a form of economic warfare.
Right.
Like, sanctions are not like, there's no such thing as a targeted sanction.
Yeah.
Like, you don't just target one politician, it impacts people. And that we saw during COVID, especially at the beginning, like so many people in Iran died. And why? Of course, like, Iran has qualified doctors. That's not why. It's because they couldn't get necessary medical equipment because of the ongoing, you know, U.S. sanctions on Iran.
Yeah.
And I even remember, like, same with Syria. Like, one of my friends from Syria, her dad had a form of Parkinson's disease that was very treatable. but because of the sanctions, he couldn't get the necessary medicine that he needed, and he died.
Yeah.
And so it's that we have to leave it, like, the people have to be sovereign. The Iranian people, you know, have the right to their own sovereignty, just like Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, and that it's our role here in the U.S. to call end to sanctions on these, because sanctions kill people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is all these societies have contradictions and they have power inequalities, and I just assume that, and people should fight them.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, as we know, is anti-imperialist feminists and anti-racist, and also ourselves, you know, shaped by racial capitalism in the United States as immigrants and children of immigrants. People will fight they will fight the contradictions. They will fight for what they need. And I recently read something really great in an essay, I think by Anne Getz. Hopefully it was in a paper that I was researching. And she said, often there's an assumption that other people's cultures don't change. Actually, it's a classic, you know, it's actually classic Orientalist that the cultures are rigid, whereas within societies, especially that are colonized, imperialized, people know that their societies are dynamic. They know that cultures change, that societies are dynamic, it's grounded. They know the variety that exists in their own societies. They know better than anybody what are the barriers, the dilemmas, things like that. So, so for me, that's my issue. It's not that I think it's great to require, I think it's terrible to require, require hijab, for example. I don't love the Taliban. I don't, right. And, you know, because I'm in Black Alliance for Peace and I'm on the Afghanistan committee. And it's this,
you're on the Afghanistan committee.
Yeah. And so it's just this constant, balance, but you need to stop killing people.
Exactly.
And you need, like, what are the main contradictions? And they are war and extraction and sanctions and housing. And the same applies in our own settings.
Yeah. And just especially as women, like, we understand these power dynamics, right? And so because of that, we always see women at the forefront of resistance, and Palestinian women are no exception.
Exactly.
And in many ways, like, Palestinian women were leading the first intifada, right?
Yes.
The first uprising.
That was the basis of my dissertation.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. Yeah. So then you know about the stories and how they, like, hosted cooking classes, but then they actually it was about organizing, and how can we do this together, and it was a lot of political education and the fact that, you know, Israel had banned raising the flag, so Palestinian women would hide, everyone would take a different color of the fabric and then they would come together and sew these really large flags. And so, and even till today, we see the role of women organizations within the Palestinian resistance, and even queer organizations like Al-Qaus and Aswat. And, you know, something that Aswat does, they have actually, created, I think, new words, and they have a vocabulary about, different gender affirming terms, and they'll go and do workshops within Palestinian communities of how we can identify and talk about people who are non-binary. And so and they too are also against the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and they see how these things, they're not separate, right? And that all of these issues are connected. And so, like you're saying, cultures obviously change, and we are combating these things within our own society. And that what's important for people, especially in the U.S., to know is to let people be sovereign and to be able to govern themselves and have their right to self-determination, because we are doing the work, you know. And even of Afghanistan, I think back in the 70s, right, when you have the revolution in Afghanistan, and then you went around and the leaders went around and educated so many people, right? And literacy rate went like soared.
Yes.
Yeah, it was
and
incredible.
that matters. And I mean, the other issue with Aswat and Qaus is that they're like from the river to the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this
Exactly.
it's refusing also these kinds of divisions of Palestinians and the parts, you know, because that is part of the apartheid system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we often see how oppressors and people in power always try to divide us and have us pitted against each other, right? The divide and conquer, which back to the Shaw University when the city council is like, oh, the rezoning is not related to the mosque, and they're trying to like pit people against each other.
Right.
But we have to realize that we have a common enemy, and despite our internal contradictions within ourselves, there's a lot more that we agree on than we disagree on, and that we have to come and unite on these things so that we can fight together and to actually fight for a world that puts the people's needs first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dana. This was great.
Yeah.
My first podcast interview in real life. I interviewed Sina on online, and hopefully that turned out well. So, do you want to tell people? Is there anything that where you write stuff, where they should follow you if they want to know anything?
I was like, where do I write stuff?
If there's nothing, he'll cut it out.
Okay.
Yeah, but if there's something you want to tell people,
let's see. I guess I post on my Instagram. That might be a good story.
Great.
So Cuote32, Cuote 32.
Great.
Yeah, it's cute because I'm so cute that I created my own word.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good.
So sometimes I'll share things that I do or write, and even some of my academic work that also talks about, you know, what we were talking about earlier, the impact of housing and neighborhoods on health. So
your academic work is, you're an epidemiologist, and so you work, just give us a quick, what do you work on academically?
So as a social and spatial epidemiologist, I assess how different features of the neighborhood environment impact health. So if you're like living close to a roadway, how does the air pollution or the noise pollution together, how they might increase your risk for dementia, for example.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.